On June 22, 2024, Needham residents may have been startled to see 18th century British soldiers making camp on Needham's town common. However, they are not redcoats trying to collect the king's taxes, but rather a reenactment group endeavoring to both entertain and educate the public.
We are a British reenacting unit that represents the British Light Infantry in a specific regiment, the 4th King's Own Regiment of Foot, in the course of the American Revolution. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, which is set to kick off next year, we are increasing the number of events that we're doing in local towns.
This sort of fictitious scenario that brings us to Needham is not actually that far-fetched. There would have been expeditions sent out to keep an eye on things. Maybe not light infantry. There were dragoons, people on horses that would do patrols and things.
I guess you could say we are kind of a recruiting party, or a party that's come here to represent the king and his authority. Really what we're here to do today is educate people, and so we've got a lot of displays of kit, of tools, weapons, anything that the British Army would have had on them.
I filled out the application for the Needham Cultural Council to try to bring us here, and they were very excited, and we're very happy to be here. This is a great way to interact with the public and do sort of one-on-one. I think a lot of people sort of show up at a major reenactment. They see the soldiers marching around, they see the smoke and fire, and it's exciting, and it is a wonderful piece of living history. But I think that when you have a chance to speak one-on-one with people, you have a much better chance to really learn something.
All right. Oh my goodness, what a mess. Stand up straight, for goodness sakes. You look at me. Your musket is held in your right hand, in your right hand, in your right hand, your other right. Excellent. Your right hand. To the right, face. To the left, face.
A lot of people in our unit really enjoy doing the educational side of things. A lot of people have degrees in history. A lot of the people as well in this unit had some kind of military service, and they enjoyed that camaraderie and being in the military service again, even if it's just on a weekend and even if it's just reenacted. I started reenacting in 2014. I grew up in upstate New York in Albany, and in grade school I would go to reenactments I would have in the Albany area. And I always felt bad for the British because they are usually outnumbered on the field by Americans. Everyone wants to be an American. No one wants to be the bad guy. That was kind of like, oh, I should give this a try when I get older and more established. So I got married in 2014, moved to Boston, and was like, oh, let me give this a try. So I happened to be on Facebook and saw that our unit was having an event that Saturday. Well, come and check it out, and I really meshed well with the people in that unit and have been with them ever since.
I'm actually an artist, and I was doing a series, I continue to do it, of historically inspired paintings. So I was working with reenactors as models, and what they were doing seemed like an awful lot of fun. So I kind of got roped into it that way. I've reenacted other time periods, but most of my reenacting these days is with the 4th Foot because it's such a great group. So for us, it's a hobby. This isn't like a paid job. We're what's called a progressive group, which means we try to be as accurate as possible to the period. So just about everything I'm wearing now is period correct. There's a few nods to safety and sort of modernity, but otherwise what we're aiming to do is kind of represent the soldiers who came here. We are the bad guys in the American Revolution. It's fun to be a bad guy.
There's nothing like marching down a street and getting booed by children and like grimacing and snarling back at them. That's fun.
Why be a bad guy? Well, first of all, in the course of being a bad guy, these guys aren't too bad. As reenactors, we encounter tons of misconceptions. For example, we sometimes hear that British soldiers were drafted. There was no draft in Britain. It would have been all volunteers. Whereas, actually, ironically, in the American colonies, you were more or less required to be in the militia. In the American South, for example, the British issued a proclamation saying that if a slave joined the British Army, he would be freed, and that would be it. And you can imagine how white American Southerners felt about that. People say, oh, you weren't free to have a gun in America. Not true. Everyone had guns. You had to pay heavy taxes. The taxes were a joke. And most of your taxes you paid to local people. It was just that there was a small amount of taxes that were going to the foreign government that they thought was an insult. Yes, there's tons of problems with British colonialism. We could pick that apart all day. But the truth is that at this time, the British represented more than just law and order. They represented the way things were, the government. And when the Americans rebelled, there were many Americans who thanked God that the British were around, that the soldiers were there to restore order. So we don't usually think of the American Revolution as a civil war, but the fact is it was also a civil war. Thousands of Americans took up arms and wore red coats to fight their neighbors who they felt were in error. And after the war, thousands and thousands of Americans were driven from their homes. They went to Canada, they went to the Caribbean, they went all over the world.
Right, so I guess if you were around during that time, would you have fought for the Red?
No.
You made a pretty good case for them.
I would hope that I would see that the wave of the future, that the wave of freedom was with the American Revolution. I would think so. But I think that the idea of demonizing the British as these drafted, hired soldiers who are here to kill and plunder does not only a disservice to the British, but it changes the burdens on Americans for understanding what they were willing to do to get rid of an enemy that wasn't entirely bad.
These reenactors represent part of a unit that was called the 4th King's Own Regiment of Foot. Established in 1680, it was one of the most prestigious regiments in the British Army. On paper, most foot regiments at this time were supposed to have a nominal strength of about 1,000 men. In reality, most regiments were only about half that strength, or less. And furthermore, these reenactors do not represent the entire 4th Regiment, but only one company, the Light Infantry Company.
So a regiment was made up of 10 companies. 8 of them were normal, what we would call hat companies, and they would form the line, and that would be your main fighting force of the regiment. Then there were 2 specialist companies, the Grenadiers, which were established first. They were originally designed as kind of shock troops. They were the tallest and the strongest, and they were originally armed with grenades. Light infantry was a concept that was created in the French and Indian War, specifically for North American concerns. What we tend to forget is how alien the North American world was to Europeans. There were just trees and forests everywhere. In Europe at this time, most of the forests had been cleared and cut down, and so an army that's designed to fight over relatively flat fields in Europe is not well designed to fight in North America, especially where the French and Indian War was fought mostly in upstate New York, of mountains and hills and broken terrain. So the light infantry was an attempt to capture kind of the Native American style of fighting loose, dispersed, moving from cover to cover, kind of acting as like a screen or a shield for the main force. That concept kind of started for the British with Rogers Rangers, and that was an American provincial formation made up of men from America. And then British officers saw this and were like, oh, that's a good idea. Each of our regiments should have people that can fight in a similar manner. And so that started this creation of a light infantry corps, which was a company of men from each unit. And the light infantry were not the strongest and the bravest, but probably the fittest and the most intelligent. They have to be far more dispersed and out of the direct maybe line of sight or line of control of an officer than a regular line company. So you have to have a certain level of individual initiative and intelligence. Oftentimes they would break into file partners, so 2 people, much like the modern American Army fights of battle buddy system of one man fires while the other man watches. And then when the man that's fired has reloaded, the man that's watching can fire, so that there's always someone watching with a loaded weapon to the front in case something comes up at him.
British troops had been occupying Boston since 1768, but after the Boston Tea Party in late 1773, the 4th Regiment of Foot, along with other British units, were sent to bolster the garrison even further.
In an attempt to bring tensions down, the British military governor had closed the port of Boston to imports from the rest of the colony, and this was a big economic blow and also a big hit to the city's food supply, because food now had to be brought overland from other places in New England.
Most of outside of Boston was pretty staunchly anti-British at the time. So they set up camp in Boston, and most of Boston Common was an armed military camp, just full of tents, thousands and thousands of soldiers. And remember, the point of the soldiers there was to try to calm down the situation. And of course, when they were there was chances for the British soldiers to misbehave. People developed a resistance to them. Even if you had neutral feelings, you weren't happy to see British soldiers around. But just like America found out in war after war, controlling a big city doesn't mean you control the countryside. And when the British made an effort to grab some weapons that they thought were in Concord, that's when the war started.
It was in the early morning of April 19th, 1775, that British troops were roused from sleep and sent out by boat from Boston into the hostile countryside. But instead of assembling full regiments together, the British opted to call only on the flank companies, the light infantry and grenadiers.
During the American Revolution, they experimented with mixed success of taking all the light infantry companies from all the regiments and clumping them into one light infantry regiment, which is great in theory, but is hard in concept. They did this just before Lexington and Concord. So these people and the officers did not have a record of working together. Like, everyone was kind of unfamiliar with working with each other. So when you don't know how the rest of the people in the unit are working, that can lead to problems and breakdowns of communication.
The following is a diary entry by John Barker, a lieutenant in the 4th Regiment Light Infantry Company.
Last night, between 10 and 11 o'clock, all the grenadiers and light infantry of the Army, making about 600 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Smith, embarked and were landed upon the opposite shore of Cambridge Marsh. Few but the commanding officers knew what expeditions we were going upon. After going a few miles, we learned that about 5 miles down the road, in a town called Lexington, there were hundreds of people collected together intending to oppose us. At 5 o'clock, we arrived there and saw a number of people, I believe between 200 and 300, formed on a common in the middle of town. We still continued advancing, keeping prepared against an attack without intending to attack them. But on our coming near them, they fired 1 or 2 shots, upon which our men, without any orders, rushed in upon them, fired, and put them to flight. Several of them were killed. We had a man of the 10th Light Infantry wounded, nobody else hurt.
Nobody knows quite how the battle started, but it was the British who did the shooting and killed 8 people on the green. I mean, we call it a battle, but as far as we know, there was almost no return fire from the Americans.
We then formed on the common, but with some difficulty, the men were so wild they could hear no orders. We waited a considerable time there, and at length proceeded on our way to Concord, which we then learned was our destination, in order to destroy a magazine of stores collected there.
Upon arriving in Concord, the battalion was split into smaller units to search for guns, powder, and ammunition.
The Americans think that the British have set fire to Concord, which they didn't. They were burning some supplies. They're actually being relatively polite because they were trying not to inflame the population. But the population saw the smoke and figured that the British had just torched the town.
3 companies from the 4th, 10th, and 43rd were sent to guard the North Bridge. It was here that Lieutenant Barker found himself in the thick of the action once again.
During this time, the people were gathering together in great numbers, and taking advantage of our scattered disposition, seemed as if they were going to cut off the communication with the bridge. Our 3 companies drew up in the road on the far side of the bridge, expecting to be attacked by the rebels, who were about 1,000 strong. Captain Laurie, who commanded these 3 companies, sent to Colonel Smith begging him to send more troops to his assistance. But the colonel, being a very fat, heavy man, would not have reached the bridge in half an hour, though it was not half a mile to it. In the meantime, the rebels marched into the road and were coming down upon us when Captain Laurie made his men retire to this side of the bridge, which, by the by, he ought to have done it first, and then he would have had time to make a good disposition. But the rebels got so near him that his people were obliged to form the best way they could as soon as they were over the bridge. The 3 companies got one behind the other so that only the front one could fire. The fire soon began, but there being nobody to support the front company, we were forced to quit the bridge and return towards Concord. 4 officers of 8 who were at the bridge were wounded, 3 men killed, 1 sergeant, and several men wounded.
60 years later, Ralph Waldo Emerson would write his poem, The Concord Hymn, describing the events that unfolded that day. The most famous line, "The shot heard round the world," has been a point of contention between the towns of Lexington and Concord. Should it refer to the shot fired at Lexington Green, or the fight at Concord's North Bridge? Clearly, Emerson was of the opinion that it should refer to the latter.
I would say as far as the Americans not being the victim anymore, that's when the shooting started. And the interesting thing there is that if you go to Concord Bridge, there are graves there. I believe that's 4th Foot. Technically that's British soil, there's 2 little British flags, and we've sort of mounted an honor guard there. We do that once a year, trying to honor the people who are involved. One of the things people don't understand is how well organized the Americans were, how ready they were to sound the alarm. You know, we think of like Paul Revere riding through town and saying the British are coming. People were ready. Every town had like 80 people ready to go. That's the Minutemen. If you give people a day or two, you could have hundreds and hundreds more. And basically, if you were an adult man, you were required to have a gun and ammunition and food and a backpack ready to go. This was because only a generation or two earlier, these towns were fighting for their lives in King Philip's War or in the French and Indian War, and they all understood that this was a local responsibility.
After the 4th Foot retreated from the North Bridge, they rejoined with the rest of the column. Having finished searching for military supplies, the British began the long march back to Boston. But the battle was far from over.
After getting as good conveniences for the wounded as we could, and having done the business we were sent upon, we set out upon our return. The country was an amazing strong one, full of hills, woods, and stone walls, which the rebels did not fail to take advantage of. In this way, we marched between 9 and 10 miles, their numbers increasing from all parts, while ours was reducing by deaths, wounds, and fatigue, and we were totally surrounded with such an incessant fire as it's impossible to conceive. Our ammunition was likewise near expended. In this critical situation, we perceived the 1st Brigade coming to our assistance. As soon as the rebels saw this reinforcement and tasted the field pieces, they retired.
We were almost overwhelmed, and then we were rescued at Lexington by a relief column, and then we were treated all the way further to what was called Monotony at the time, which is now called Arlington. It was a huge battle in Arlington, just right on the basically main street in Arlington.
It was here that the Needham militia would come face to face with the Redcoats. But that's a story for another day.
The initial attack was 800 men or so. It was the Light Company and the Grenadier Company, so they gathered all the best of the best, and they sent them out on this run to Concord, basically, to try to do things before people could respond. But because everyone responded with the Minutemen, they were rescued by the regular soldiers in a much bigger force. So there were thousands of soldiers who marched out to help those 800. But by the end of the day, I believe it was roughly 300 killed and the wounded. And remember, there was no carts, very few horses, so they were dragging wounded guys back to Boston. People were fighting from house to house, right, being ambushed over and over and over again on the way back. From the British perspective of everything went wrong. There wasn't supposed to be a war that day. And then finally, when we got close enough to Boston, there were British ships in the harbor that were using their heavy cannon to drive the Americans back. And we retreated into Boston, and we did not leave Boston. By the end of the day, there were something like 20 to 30,000 Americans around the city of Boston, keeping us trapped in Boston. And we held on to Boston until evacuation day, when the Americans dragged cannons all the way back from Fort Ticonderoga in New York. They dragged them to Dorchester Heights, set them up, started shooting at the British ships, and the British said, "That's it, we're done." And we packed up and left Boston. And as far as Boston was concerned, that was the end of the war.
But it was not the end of the war for the 4th Foot. They fought in several engagements through 1777, including the Battle of Bunker Hill, Long Island, and White Marsh. But by the beginning of 1778, the regiment was sent to St. Lucia, where it would stay for the remainder of the war.
We spent the second half of the war in the Caribbean, which there wasn't as much active fighting, but there was lots of disease. So a lot of us died of what they called the yellow jack, other sort of tropical diseases, as we gradually figured out that the wool uniforms might not be the best thing for the Caribbean in July.
Despite the early success of the Americans in Boston, the tides of war would soon turn in Britain's favor.
There was a time when it looked like the British were going to hold on to most of the United States. The Americans were dug hundreds of trenches around New York City. They were ready to defend it to the death, and the British conquered it in an easy afternoon. The Royal Navy was basically totally unchallenged. The Americans tried to take Canada. That did not work well for the Americans. I guess what I'm trying to say is, at the start of the war, it seemed inevitable that the British might win, but anyone who was there at Lexington and Concord and saw thousands of ordinary Americans running out with their guns to take pot shots at British soldiers would realize there was a problem. You know, if you had genuinely, say, 500,000 angry American men, which you could easily summon, the British Army, which was only like 60 or 70, 80,000 strong at the time, and had other responsibilities around the world, could not possibly hold on to a country that didn't want to be held on to.
The colonies also had some help from a much greater power. Yeah, but I was actually referring to the French.
We ultimately won with a lot of foreign help. The French joined the war, the Spanish, we had the Dutch helping. Everyone was happy to take the British down a peg. A lot of people don't know this. 90% of the ammunition used in the American Revolution by the Americans came from the French. Without French help, we had no chance. No chance. We couldn't make good cannon. We didn't have a navy. The Battle of Yorktown was won not just by Americans and French troops fighting, but because the French fleet had for one glorious minute chased the British fleet away. And remember, we had volunteers coming from all over abroad to teach the Americans how to fight. Von Steuben, Pulaski, all these names, sort of heroes and adventurers who came to help the Americans win.
As the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution draws near, interest in our nation's founding will continue to ramp up. And these redcoats are more than up to the challenge of teaching people what it means to be an American.
I actually think an event like this, having a good understanding of the American Revolution, its causes, what people thought, how people felt, can be a wonderful thing. When you understand the bad guys better, you get a better understanding of the good guys, which I think is your responsibility as an American, to understand why we did what we did.